Hi, my name is Kristen Chrisman, and I'm going to be reading today the first part of a 7-part essay that I wrote. It's called Paradigm for Peace Applied to Russia, Ukraine, and the U.S. Proposal for a Peaceful Pathway Forward. And this essay is based upon a model that I created in the fall of 9/11 called Paradigm for Peace. And I'd spent the next 20 years applying that model, researching and writing and applying it primarily to the conflicts between the Middle East and the United States that had led to 9/11. But also I ran the model through other conflicts such as the Cold War and Nazi Germany and the U.S. Civil War and other conflicts. So what I did is I did a really condensed analysis based on what I could do in a few weeks on the current crisis, because my work has not been accepted for publishing anywhere, and I thought the least I can do is get the ideas out there in case they're helpful onto YouTube. And countercurrents.org, like they did last time, they're kindly publishing every part of this essay. So if you're interested in reading it, or if you're interested in looking at the sources, the endnotes, they're all there on countercurrents.org. Part 1, Introduction. U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin stated that Western nations will continue, quote, moving heaven and earth, end quote, to send weapons to Ukraine in its war against Russia. While they may be moving earth, it's doubtful they're moving heaven, which could very well be enraged at U.S. policymakers' habit of seizing for itself divine powers to inflict massive amounts of death whenever conflict looms on the horizon. For good reason, so much power was never intended to be in the hands of mere mortals. U.S. policymakers are responding to the current crisis in Ukraine with weapon shipments. They responded to the outbreak of Ukraine's civil war in 2014 with weapon shipments. In fact, the very factors that provoked Russia to invade Ukraine in the first place pertain precisely to Western weapons. The West's obsessive clinging to militarism in the form of NATO expansion, missile launchers at bases in Eastern Europe, NATO joint military training with nations along Russia's borders, and shipments of billions in dollars of weapons to help Ukraine attack Donetsk and Luhansk. There have also been reports of U.S. private military contractors training far right-wing extremists in Ukraine during the Civil War. In addition, Russia accuses the U.S. of developing biological weapons in Ukraine, and Russia accuses forces loyal to Kiev of preparing to launch a chemical attack in Ukraine. If Western weapons provoked Russia, why then would more Western weapons be the solution? For those who can't think outside the box of 245 years of U.S. foreign policy grounded in weaponry, war, and greed, weapons are the answer. It's like a home on a hot summer day that has only one thing in the fridge: weapons. For 245 years, the U.S. government has been like an ostrich with its head in the sand, refusing to see the immense damage inflicted upon society and the planet by its unwarranted, magical faith in weapons. Refusing to see, it's unable to learn, and therefore persists in its habit of responding to foreign threats, not with efforts to reduce tension and increase harmony between opposing sides, but with weapons, threats, and the escalation of tension. When foreign nations are immersed in civil wars, U.S. policymakers never impartially seek reconciliation between all sides. Instead, they perpetually take sides to further their own ulterior motives. Hence the need to send weapons to help one side kill off and dominate the other, as if one side is so good and the other side so evil that one deserves to kill and the other deserves to be killed. U.S. policymakers then cut off communication with the enemy, thus further preventing the ability to understand the enemy's point of view, and making all the more possible a blackout of truth within the U.S. that in turn bolsters the perception of the enemy as malicious and deserving of death. Yet every one of these steps is a backward step, away from peace and away from truth and understanding. Why should we apply on the international level forms of human relations that we would never condone at the level of personal, local, or national relations? Why should we allow violence to determine who will acquire which resources and markets? when violence would never be accepted as a tool to allow one U.S. corporation to take over the market of another. Our goal should be reconciliation between both sides, not conquest of one side over the other. And the power we need isn't technological power, but a power that has been missing in action amongst the U.S. foreign policymakers for 245 years. The power of hearts, minds, and spirits to foster across lines of conflict qualities of love, truth, peace, understanding, and joy. The power and will needed to adhere to such qualities and pursue non-violent solutions of conflict resolution and reconciliation can be compared to that of a hero clinging to the side of a cliff, struggling to reach a branch just overhead, and determined not to fall but to keep trying no matter what. But instead of that hero, we have President Joe Biden, who recently decided that Americans have to fork over an additional $33 billion in military aid to help Ukraine wage war for U.S. policymakers against Russia. Rather than applying backward, dysfunctional forms of human relations to international conflict, let's place our consciousness in our hearts, turn on our brain power, and impartially, logically, cooperatively, and peacefully address the roots of violence on all sides of conflict. While there are many approaches to nonviolent conflict resolution, I'll provide a condensed analysis here using my own model, in the hope that it may help with the current crisis, if anyone is listening at all. This essay was hard to keep down to size because more and more issues, examples, and perspectives can always be found. However, I trust that this abbreviated analysis, as imperfect as it may be, can enable us to take several leaps forward in a helpful direction across the stepping stones of the river. And I hope that readers can add to this their own knowledge and insights to further this analysis and develop the national and international resolve to seek cooperative, nonviolent conflict resolution. The autumn of 9/11, I created a model called Paradigm for Peace, which has 4 parts: the defensive and aggressive roots of violence, the mental, legal, and physical escalators of violence, 3 facets of solutions, and a cooperative quest attitude of thought and dialogue. I spent the next 20 years writing a multi-volume work on foreign policy and peace, in which I applied the model primarily to the Mideast U.S. conflicts, but also to other conflicts, including the Cold War, Nazi Germany, and the U.S. Civil War. This 4th element, the cooperative quest attitude, is the model's underlying and ever-present dynamic. Participants in dialogue and conflict resolution strive to uphold attitudes of bold amiability, curiosity for the truth, and a determination to figure out how to make the pieces of the puzzle of peace fit together. Participants express themselves clearly and solidly, yet with just as much strength they endeavor to genuinely understand opposing perspectives and get in their shoes. They can even practice temporarily switching roles and arguing sincerely on behalf of those on the other side of conflict. Unlike a debate in which each side views victory in terms of beating the other and making knockout verbal jabs, in cooperative quest dialogue, winning is cooperative, and victory is the growth of truth, understanding, and harmony for all. Using this open-minded, cooperative attitude of thought and dialogue, the key to promote impartiality is to cast aside the belief that conflict is always a case of one's own good guys fighting defensively against aggressive bad guys. Instead, we look at both the defensive and aggressive motivations experienced by all the different sides, both in the larger external conflict, which involves Russia, the U.S., and NATO, and others, as well as by those in the internal conflict within Ukraine, including those Ukrainians who support Russia, those who support the U.S. and NATO, those who support violence in this conflict, and those who don't. It's important to non-violently address all the fronts of conflict, both the external international and internal national conflicts, because they feed off each other. Throughout the Cold War, U.S. conflicts perpetually fed off the internal conflicts of other nations. U.S. policymakers, perhaps deceiving themselves that they were fighting evil, would take advantage of other nations' internal tensions, fuel them with weapon shipments and military aid, and used the conflict to try to indirectly fight the USSR, even if the USSR's involvement was just a figment of US policymakers' imaginations, as in Greece, following World War II. Sometimes US policymakers would bait the USSR into conflict, as they did in Afghanistan in 1979. We should also address the multiple fronts of conflict and friction that likely exist within each side. And we should be sure to break down the analysis to separate the views of policymakers from civilians. After all, policymakers cannot speak for civilians, even though they try to all the time. Biden and Ukraine's President Zelensky are stating or implying that Ukrainian civilians want weapons. But do they really? Or do they favor nonviolent conflict resolution? There are more fronts of conflict amongst policymakers themselves within Ukraine, Russia, and the US. Hopefully, cooperative dialogue can be developed into a habit used by policymakers to learn to treat their differences of opinion in a functional and caring manner, rather than in a threatened manner that leads to the silencing, intimidation, or firing of those who disagree. It's crucial to never deliberately exclude any group from this thoughtful, caring analysis, no matter what, but to take the time to impartially consider and understand how all of these actors feel threatened. It's important to analyze the roots of conflict comprehensively, and a rough, comprehensive understanding can be acquired quite quickly, even within a single hour of discussion. Nonviolent conflict resolution actually saves time, because the process doesn't psychologically, socially, physically, and financially retard the road to peace the way war and sanctions do. The obstacle to nonviolent conflict resolution isn't time. The obstacle is U.S. policymakers' lack of commitment to choose cooperative nonviolence. When you analyze various conflicts and make the effort to lay out the roots and escalators of violence, you come to a stunning conclusion. There's barely a single root or escalator of violence that can be remedied or even alleviated by weapons, violence, war, threats, and sanctions. Perhaps this is why U.S. foreign policymakers refuse to examine the roots of conflict. They know the truth will put war and weapon corporations out of business. And they know they'll no longer be able to use war and fighting for freedom and rescuing humanity as a pretext to gobble up foreign resources and markets, and to shut down Nord Stream 2. On the other hand, perhaps some really do believe they're fighting for freedom. Judging by the bizarre and illogical reactions of U.S. experts who felt offended and threatened by President Putin's 2007 speech in Munich and his July 2021 essay, a speech and an essay that actually delivered admirable and honorable ideas, it could be that U.S. foreign policymakers honestly see the world as much more threatening than it really is, because they lack skills in relating to, cooperating with, and even understanding the words and intentions of other people and nations. In the following parts of this essay, we'll run the current Ukraine crisis through the Paradigm for Peace model in order to gain insight into the roots and escalators of violence and a cooperative, intelligent approach towards peace and justice. Thank you very, very much for listening.